So now that we know a whole bunch of information about programming languages and how and where to write them, along with the print statement under our belts, let's go over some other things the computer can do all by itself, without you having to tell him how to. More specifically, we'll be covering basic number mathematics as well as string math. Starting off with basic mathematics, the computer already knows how to do simply arithmetics. This includes addition, subtraction, multiplication and division, all of which are represented by the symbols shown on the screen now. In any IDE that you may install, you'll be able to print out the answer to simple math problems using the print statement, which may seem counterintuitive because why would you use the computer to do math when you have a perfectly good calculator on your phone? But you have to remember that computers are dumb, and anything we want a computer to do, we have to build up from scratch. Basic arithmetic, while simple, helps out in almost any program you may write. For example, if we wanted to build a basic calculator app, we need to utilize this functionality in order to correctly display the answer to an arithmetic problem when our user tries to add, subtract, multiply or divide two numbers. Now, in addition to the four basic math equations, most programming languages include an additional operator known as modulus. If this is your first time hearing this word, don't worry, since it's not usually taught in math classes. Modulus allows us to get the remainder of a divisional operation. For example, when we take 10 modulus 3, we are essentially telling the computer to take 10 divided by 3, ignore the actual answer and just give us that remainder of that operation. In this case 1, since when we divide 10 by 3, the answer is 3, remainder 1. The 1 in this case is what gets printed out to the console. If there is no remainder, say in the case that we take 50 modulus 2, since the remainder is 0, the function would return 0 if we were to print it out. This can be extremely useful in many cases, the most obvious being if we want to determine whether or not a certain integer is even or odd. If we take a certain number, modulus 2, and it returns 0, then we know it's even, since any even number divided by 2 will always result in a full answer without a remainder. But if the system returns 1, then we know that the integer is odd. You will find yourself using basic math operations a lot more than you think, so it's good to keep them in mind when writing your programs. Now our computer can work with numbers as well as strings. Strings, by the way, are another way to just say text. For example, hello world is a string, the letter A is a string, anything enclosed by quotation marks is denoted as a string in programming language. We'll be cover more about strings in a bit when we talk about variables, but for now, let's continue. We already talked about printing strings to the console, but let's say we're making a game and we want to print out the statement game over, 4 was your final score. Now, while we could just make that string that says that exact phrase and print it out to the console, in some cases it would be more useful to print out the actual integer value, especially in the case of a game where the score can change each time you play, because score definitely isn't always going to be 4. Well, we were also able to print multiple strings of text and even integers by adding them together in the print statement. This is called concatenation. Continuing with our score example, if we wanted to print out the statement game over, 4 was your final score, using 4 as an integer rather than a string, we could do this by breaking down the statement into 2 strings and an integer, like so. Print game over plus 4 plus was your final score. We of course begin with a print statement, which again will be different across all languages. Inside the print statement, we start off by printing the string game over. Now here comes the important part. From there we use a plus sign and add 4 to the print statement, just like if you were adding two numbers. Then we can repeat this process with another plus sign for the final string was your final score, and we are able to print out the entirety of our statement easily. Doing this, we can easily print out multiple different strings and integers together in one print statement. We could also combine the two lessons we learned this far and do something like game over plus 4 in parentheses plus 4 was your final score. In this case, let's say we're having a game which gives you a base score, then 4 points for a certain task you completed. This demonstration also displays another important part of programming, which is that oftentimes to get your program to be the most efficient, you have to combine aspects of code. Now it's important to note that the computer will take whatever you put in parentheses and print it out character for character, so oftentimes programmer will forget to add a space onto the end of their strings. This can result in a small mistake in which the string from the previous example will be printed out as if you say game over, 4 was your final score, which isn't that appeasing when displayed on screen to the user, so it's good practice to always put a space after and before your strings to make sure this doesn't happen and your string doesn't end up like this. Another important thing to note is the difference between 4 in quotation marks and 4 without quotation marks. Now 4 in quotation marks is treated as a string rather than a 4 without quotation marks, which is treated as a number. This may not seem like a big deal, but again, computers are dumb, and if you try to do math with a number in quotation marks, it will return an error, because the computer doesn't understand that you are trying to perform the operation on a number, and it thinks you're trying to add an integer to a string, which is a big no-no in programming. So when you are programming, make sure to make a mental note of whether or not you want to make something an integer or a string, because that type of stuff makes a big difference. Alright, that concludes our segments of the base power of computers. I will see you in the next lecture.